Each morning before sunrise, she set out scraps of food by the old barn, calling softly to the stray dogs and hungry cats no one else cared for. Her hands were rough, her clothes worn, but her kindness never wavered. What she didn't see was the cowboy watching from afar, a quiet man on horseback, eyes filled with admiration. To her, he was just another passerby, but in truth, he was a millionaire, and her simple act of compassion had just captured his heart. The wind came first, not slow, not kind, but sharp and hungry, tearing across the flats beyond Dry Hollow like something wounded and looking for company. It stripped the dust off the road and flung it against the shutters of empty storefronts, rattled the loose shingles on the church roof, and bent the sagebrush so low it kissed the earth. By the time the sun started bleeding out over the western ridge, the whole world had turned the color of rust and regret. That's when she appeared, a woman in a coat too thin for the season, her braid coming loose at the ends, her boots scuffed pale from use. She walked with her shoulders hunched against the wind, one hand clutching a wicker basket covered with a frayed towel, the other holding a lantern that swayed with each step. The flame inside flickered like it was trying to decide whether to stay or go. She wasn't headed toward town, she was headed away from it, past the last fence post, past the crooked sign that said Dry Hollow, population 247, past the place where decent folks stopped walking after dark, out where the strays lived. The dogs saw her first. 3 of them, maybe 4, hard to tell in the fading light. They were lean and rough-coated, the kind that had learned not to trust easy. One limped, another had an ear torn half off, but when they saw her coming, they didn't run. They waited. She knelt in the dirt. The wind pulled at her hair, at her coat, at the edge of the towel covering her basket. She didn't seem to notice. She set the lantern down beside her and lifted the towel slow, like she was unwrapping something sacred. Inside were scraps, bread crusts, a heel of cornbread, some kind of meat wrapped in paper. Not much, maybe not even enough for one meal, let alone 4 mouths. But she gave it anyway. The first dog crept forward, belly low, eyes wide. She didn't reach for it, didn't make a sound, just held out a piece of bread in her open palm and waited. The dog sniffed, hesitated, then took it gentle like it remembered once being loved. The others followed. She spoke to them soft, too soft for the wind to carry the words very far. Maybe she was telling them it was all right, maybe she was telling herself. Either way, her voice was the only warm thing for miles. Behind her, just beyond the glow of the lantern, something moved. A man. He stood by the hitching post outside the old freight station, one boot propped against the rail, his arms crossed loose over his chest. He wore a hat pulled low, brim shadowing most of his face, but not all of it. Not enough to hide the scar that ran from his cheekbone to his jaw, pale against sun-dark skin. His coat was long and heavy, the kind a man wore when he'd seen his share of winters and didn't plan on freezing through another. He didn't call out, didn't move, just watched. The woman stayed on her knees, breaking the bread into smaller pieces, murmuring things the wind swallowed whole. One of the dogs, the one with the limp, pressed its nose against her wrist. She smiled, not big, not showy, just a small, tired smile that said she'd been doing this long enough to know it mattered, even if no one else thought so. Thunder rolled in from somewhere far off, low and slow, like the sky clearing its throat. She looked up. The clouds had started piling up on the horizon, dark and heavy, moving faster than seemed natural. The kind of storm that didn't ask permission, the kind that just came. She gathered the dogs closer, one hand on the back of the limping one, the other reaching for the basket. The wind kicked up harder now, pulling at the towel, scattering dust across the road. The lantern flame guttered and nearly died. That's when the lightning came, not a warning, not a flicker. A crack so loud and so bright it turned the whole prairie white for half a second. The thunder followed so fast there was no space between them. The dogs scattered, all but the one with the limp, which pressed itself against her leg and whined low in its throat. She didn't run. She dropped the basket and pulled the dog close, wrapping both arms around it, bending her body over its back like a shield. The rain started then, hard and cold, driven sideways by the wind. It soaked through her coat in seconds. Her braids stuck to her neck. Her hands trembled, but she didn't let go. Another crack of lightning, closer this time. And then, footsteps, heavy, steady, moving through the rain like it wasn't even there. The man from the hitching post was walking toward her. Not fast, not slow, just deliberate. His hat was still low, his coat slick with rain, his boots leaving deep prints in the mud. She looked up at him, water streaming down her face, her eyes wide but not afraid, just startled. He stopped a few feet away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rain hammered down between them. The dog in her arms shivered. Somewhere in the distance, another roll of thunder, softer now, already moving on. He crouched down slow, careful, like he didn't want to spook her. His eyes were dark under the brim of his hat, dark and steady and carrying something she couldn't name. Not anger, not pity, something else. He reached out, not toward her, but toward the basket she'd dropped. He picked it up, shook the water off the towel, and held it out to her. She stared at him, then at the basket, then back at him. "You shouldn't be out here," he said. His voice was low, rough around the edges, like it hadn't been used much lately. "Neither should they," she said, nodding toward the dogs scattered in the storm. He didn't argue, just set the basket down beside her and stood. For a second she thought he might leave, but he didn't. He just stood there in the rain, between her and the worst of the wind, like a wall she hadn't asked for but needed all the same. The storm settled slow, the rain thinned to a drizzle. The sky went from black to deep indigo, and the first stars started pricking through the clouds. The dogs came back one by one, shaking water from their coats, sniffing at the mud where the bread had fallen. She got to her feet, still holding the limping dog against her side. Her coat was soaked through, her braid hung heavy down her back, but she didn't look defeated, just tired. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded once, didn't say anything. She picked up the basket, the lantern, and started back toward town, the dogs trailing after her like shadows. She didn't look back, but he stayed, stood there in the mud and the fading light, watching her walk away, watching the glow of her lantern get smaller and smaller until it disappeared behind the first row of buildings. When she was gone, he finally moved, turned and walked the other direction, out past the freight station, past the place where the road ended and the open land began. His shadow stretched long behind him in the last bit of light, and the wind pushed at his back like it wanted him gone. But as the storm settled, the stranger's shadow lingered long after the rain was gone. Morning came cold and clear, the kind of morning where the air hurt to breathe and the frost turned every blade of grass into a tiny white knife. The sky was pale blue, washed clean by the storm, and the sun came up slow, like it was tired from the night before. She was already awake, had been for an hour, maybe more. She moved through the small cabin with the kind of quiet that came from living alone, footsteps soft on the wooden floor, the creak of the stove door careful, the clatter of the kettle muted by a practiced hand. The fire caught quick, and she stood there for a moment, hands held out to the warmth, eyes half closed. Outside, the dogs were waiting, not at the door. They'd learned better than that, but just beyond the fence, huddled together in the dry spot under the eaves of the old shed. She could see them through the window. 3, maybe 4, hard to tell when they piled up like that. The one with the limp was on the outside, ears up, watching the cabin like it expected her any second. She smiled despite herself, pulled on her coat, still damp from the night before, and wrapped a scarf twice around her neck. She filled a tin bowl with the last of yesterday's stew, grabbed a heel of bread from the cloth on the counter, and stepped out into the cold. The dogs stood when they saw her, tails wagging slow, uncertain. They knew her now, but trust was still a new thing, fragile and careful. She set the bowl down and stepped back. "Go on," she said softly. "It's all right." They ate, fast and hungry like they always did. She watched them, arms crossed against the cold, her breath fogging in the air. When they were done, she picked up the bowl and turned to go back inside, and stopped. There was someone by the fence, the same man from the night before, same hat, same coat, same scar catching the early light, but this time he wasn't standing back. He was crouched down, one hand held out flat, a piece of jerky resting in his palm. The limping dog was sniffing at it, cautious but curious. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. The dog took the jerky, gentle, then sat down beside him, close enough that its shoulder brushed his knee. He didn't look up, just scratched behind the dog's ear, slow and easy, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. "Thought you'd moved on," she said finally. He glanced at her then, just a quick look, nothing lingering, passing through, long pass. He almost smiled, almost, long enough. She came closer, stopped a few feet from the fence. Up close in the daylight she could see more. The scar wasn't the only mark on him. There were lines around his eyes, a tiredness in the set of his shoulders and his hands, rough, calloused, the knuckles scarred like he'd fought or worked or both. "They don't usually warm up that fast," she said, nodding toward the dog. "Maybe they know something you don't. Maybe they're just hungry." He stood then, brushed the dust off his knees, and looked at her square. His eyes were dark brown, steady, the kind of eyes that had seen things and decided not to talk about them. "You do this every day?" he asked. "Do what? Feed them, strays." She shrugged. "Somebody has to. Town know? Town doesn't care." He nodded slow, like that made sense, like he'd expected it. "You got a name?" "Clara. Clara," he repeated, testing it. Then he touched the brim of his hat. "Much obliged for yesterday." "I didn't do anything. You stayed." She didn't know what to say to that. So she didn't say anything, just stood there while he walked past her, back toward the road, his boots crunching in the frost. She thought that was it, thought he was gone for good this time. But when she turned back toward the cabin, she saw it. The jerky, a whole strip of it, laid careful on the fence post, and beside it, a coin, not copper, silver. She picked it up slow, turned it over in her palm. It was heavy, real, the kind of coin a drifter didn't just leave behind. She looked up, toward the road, but he was already gone. The frost melted by mid-morning. The sun climbed higher, and the cold gave way to something softer, almost warm. Clara spent the day like she always did, mending a tear in the shed roof, hauling water from the creek, checking the fence line for breaks. The dogs followed her most of the way, keeping a respectful distance but never wandering far. She didn't see the man again, but when she went out at dusk to call the dogs in, she found the trough by the shed had been fixed. The crack that had been leaking for weeks was patched neat, the wood still damp from fresh work, and beside it, another coin, same as the first. She looked around, half expecting to see him watching from somewhere in the shadows, but the yard was empty, just her and the dogs and the quiet. Inside, she set both coins on the table and stared at them by the light of the oil lamp. They gleamed soft in the amber glow, and for the first time in a long time, Clara felt something she couldn't quite name. Not hope, not yet, but something close. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters, whispering through the gaps in the walls. The dogs curled up by the stove, their bellies full, their breathing slow and even, and somewhere out in the cold, past the edge of town, a man sat by a fire he'd built in the hollow of an old stone wall. His hat rested on his knee, his coat hung open, and in his hand he held a small piece of wood, half carved into the shape of a dog. He worked slow, patient. The knife moved smooth and sure, peeling away thin curls of wood that fell into the fire and curled into ash. Above him, the stars came out one by one, cold and distant, and when the first snow began to fall, soft and silent, he didn't move, just kept carving, kept thinking about a woman who knelt in the mud to feed the forgotten. And when the first snow fell, she realized he hadn't vanished. He had simply moved closer. The sycamore stood alone. Not in the way all trees stand alone, separate and rooted, but in the way that made it feel like it had been there longer than the town, longer than the road, maybe longer than the memory of anyone still living. Its trunk was wide and pale, mottled like old skin, and its branches reached out in all directions like it was trying to gather something it had lost. Clara had always loved that tree. When she was small, before the cabin became hers and the feeding became a habit she couldn't break, she used to sit in its shade and watch the wagons pass. Back then, Dry Hollow had been bigger, busier, the kind of place people came to, not the kind they left. But that was before the drought, before the mine closed, before the slow bleed of families packing up and heading east, looking for rain and work and reasons to stay alive. Now the sycamore just marked the edge of her fence line, a landmark, a boundary between her land and the rest of the world. That's where she found him, not hiding, not lurking, just sitting with his back against the trunk, his hat tipped forward over his face, his legs stretched out in front of him. The dogs were there too, all 4 of them now, the ones who'd started coming regular, curled up around him like he was part of the landscape. Clara stopped at the gate, the feed bucket heavy in her hand. The sun was barely up, the sky still streaked with pink and orange, and the frost hadn't burned off yet. Her breath came out in clouds. So did his. She could see it, slow and steady, rising from beneath the brim of his hat. He wasn't asleep. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. Morning, she said, not loud, just enough to carry. He shifted, tipped his hat back with one finger, looked at her with those dark, steady eyes that gave nothing away. Morning. You planning to live under my tree now? Didn't know it belonged to anyone. Everything belongs to someone out here. He stood slow, like his body had to think about it first. The dogs stood with him, tails wagging lazy. He brushed the frost off his coat, off the seat of his pants, and walked toward her with that same deliberate gait she'd seen in the storm. Not hurried, not hesitant, just purposeful. When he reached the gate, he stopped, close enough that she could see the scar better now, the way it tugged at the corner of his mouth when he almost smiled. Close enough that she could smell wood smoke and leather and something else, something clean, like soap. Drifters didn't usually smell like soap. You got a name? She asked. Same question he'd asked her. Most people just call me what they need to. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. She waited. He didn't offer more, so she let it go. You been here all night? Some of it. You got a camp? Not far. You got food? He looked at her then, really looked, like he was trying to figure out what kind of question that was, whether it was kindness or suspicion or something in between. Enough, he said finally. She nodded. Set the bucket down. Well, if you're going to keep scaring my dogs every morning, least you could do is help feed them. It wasn't a question, wasn't really an invitation either. Just a statement. He seemed to understand that. Yes, ma'am. She opened the gate. They worked in silence. Clara scattered the feed, and he carried the water pails from the creek, 2 at a time, his shoulders steady under the weight. The dogs wove between them, eager and clumsy, and once or twice his boot nearly caught one by accident. But he always adjusted, always saw them in time. When the work was done, she leaned against the fence and watched him set the last pail down. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows now, and she could see the shape of old scars on his forearms, thin white lines, faded but still there. Rope burns, maybe, or something worse. You do this kind of work before? She asked. Some ranch hand? Among other things, always answers that weren't answers. Always just enough to keep the conversation from dying, but never enough to let her in. She should have been bothered by it. Should have been wary. But there was something about the way he moved, careful, respectful, like he understood that this was her space and he was only borrowing it, that made her want to trust him. That and the way the dogs acted. They didn't lie, didn't pretend. If a man was bad, they knew, and they didn't curl up beside him like he was safe. You fix my trough, she said, not a question. He looked at her, nodded once, and the roof on the shed, another nod. Why? He was quiet for a moment, looking out past the fence, past the tree, toward the open land beyond. The wind moved through the grass, bending it all one direction, and the morning light turned everything gold. Needed fixing, he said finally. That's not a reason. It's reason enough. She wanted to push, wanted to ask him where he came from, why he was here, what he was running from or running toward. But something in the set of his jaw told her not to, told her that whatever he was carrying, it wasn't hers to unpack. So she didn't. Instead, she said, "There's coffee inside, if you want it." He looked at her, surprised. Just a flicker, but it was there. I don't want to impose. You already did. Might as well get something out of it. This time he did smile. Small, brief, but real. Yes, ma'am. The cabin was small. One room, really, with a stove in the corner, a table by the window, a bed against the far wall, and not much else. But it was clean, warm, the kind of place that felt lived in without feeling crowded. Clara poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and set one in front of him. He held it with both hands, like he was warming them, and didn't drink right away. Just sat there, looking around slow, taking it in. You live here alone? He asked. Mostly. No family? Not anymore. He nodded, like he understood that too. Like he'd heard that answer before, maybe even said it himself. You always feed strays? He asked after a moment. You always ask questions you already know the answer to? He almost smiled again. Fair. They drank in silence. The stove crackled. Outside, the dogs barked once, twice, then settled. Clara watched him over the rim of her cup, trying to figure him out, trying to match the roughness of his hands with the way he held the cup, careful and deliberate. trying to match the scar on his face with the gentleness in his eyes. "Town talks about you," he said quietly. She stiffened. "I'm sure they do. They say you're stubborn." "Probably. Say you waste your time on animals that won't live through the winter anyway. They say a lot of things." He nodded. Took another sip. "They're wrong." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw something in his face she hadn't expected. Not pity, not even sympathy, just certainty. Like he'd already decided what kind of person she was, and nothing the town said could change it. "You don't know me," she said softly. "No," he agreed. "But I know cruelty when I see it, and I know mercy too." The weight of those words settled between them, heavy and warm, and Clara didn't know what to say. So she just looked down at her cup, at the dark surface of the coffee, and let the silence hold them both. After a while, he stood, set the cup down gentle on the table. "Thank you," he said. "For the coffee, for that, and for not asking." She met his eyes, nodded. He touched the brim of his hat, just a slight tip, nothing showy, and walked to the door. He paused there, one hand on the frame, and looked back at her. "I'll be around," he said, "if that's all right, to fix things, if they need fixing." She thought about that, thought about the coins he'd left, the trough, the roof, the way the dogs trusted him, the way he'd stood in the storm like it was nothing. "It's all right," she said. He nodded once. Then he was gone. Clara sat there for a long time after, staring at the empty chair across from her, at the cup he'd left behind. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the frost, and the world started moving again. Birds calling, wind shifting, the distant sound of a wagon on the road. But inside the cabin, it was still, quiet. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara didn't feel alone. 3 days passed. 3 days of the same careful rhythm. He'd appear at dawn, help with the feeding, fix something that needed fixing. A loose board, a bent nail, a gate that stuck. And then disappear before the sun got too high. He never stayed long, never asked for anything, just worked quiet and steady, and then he was gone. But the town noticed. Of course they did. Towns like Dry Hollow didn't have much to do besides notice. She heard it first at the general store, went in to buy flour and salt, and the conversation behind the counter stopped the second she walked through the door. Mrs. Calloway, the owner's wife, looked at her with that tight, pinched expression she reserved for people she didn't approve of. "Morning, Clara," she said, voice thin as paper. "Morning. Heard you got yourself some help out at your place." Clara set the coins on the counter. "Heard wrong, probably. Saw him myself. Tall fellow. Scar on his face. Looks like trouble." "Looks aren't always truth." Mrs. Calloway sniffed. "Where there's smoke, there's fire." Clara took her flour and salt without another word and left. But she could feel their eyes on her back, could hear the whispering start up again the second the door closed behind her. By the time she got home, the sun was high and hot, and the man was already there, crouched by the fence replacing a rotted post. The dogs lay in the shade nearby watching him work. "You know they're talking about you," Clara said, setting the supplies down. "He didn't stop working, just kept digging, kept setting the post. I know. Doesn't bother you? Not much. They think you're dangerous." He looked up at her then, squinting against the sun. "Am I?" She thought about it. Thought about the way he moved, the scars, the silence, the way he never quite answered a question straight. "I don't think so," she said finally. "Then that's all that matters." He went back to work, and she stood there watching him, feeling something shift in her chest. Something warm and uncertain and maybe a little bit like hope. That night, she left a plate of food by the sycamore, cornbread and beans wrapped in cloth. When she checked in the morning, the plate was clean, spotless, like someone had washed it in the creek, and beneath it another coin, this one different, heavier, gold. Clara picked it up slow, turned it over, and felt her heart stutter. Because this wasn't a coin a drifter carried, this was the kind of coin a rich man kept in his pocket for luck, or for remembering who he used to be. She looked out toward the tree, toward the place where she knew he slept, toward the shadow that lingered just beyond the light, and for the first time, she wondered if maybe the town was right, not about him being dangerous, but about him being something other than what he seemed. Above her, the first clouds began to gather, slow and heavy, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled soft, and when the first snow fell, she realized he hadn't vanished. He had simply moved closer. The snow came early that year. Not the kind that buried everything and made the world go silent. Just a dusting. Enough to soften the edges of things, to turn the brown grass white for an hour or two before the sun burned it off. Enough to remind everyone that winter was coming, whether they were ready or not. Clara wasn't ready. The shed still had gaps in the walls. The firewood pile was only half what it should be, and the dogs, there were 6 of them now, 2 more had shown up in the last week, needed shelter that wouldn't let the wind through. She stood in the yard at dawn, breath fogging, hands on her hips, staring at the shed like she could will it into being stronger. Need more than hoping, a voice said behind her. She didn't jump, didn't even turn, just kept staring at the shed. I know. The man came up beside her, slow and easy, like he always did. He'd been around every day for 2 weeks now, sometimes working, sometimes just sitting quiet under the sycamore, whittling or watching the sky. He still hadn't told her his name, still disappeared before dark. But the space he left when he was gone had started to feel bigger than it should. Needs insulation, he said, nodding toward the shed, and a proper door, one that closes. I know that too. You got materials? Not enough. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the shed, then at the dogs huddled together near the fence. Then he looked at her. I'll get what's needed. I can't pay you. Didn't ask you to. She turned to him then, frustration creeping into her voice despite herself. Why are you doing this? He met her eyes, steady, calm. Because it needs doing. That's not an answer. It's the only one I got. She wanted to argue, wanted to push. But the way he looked at her, not with pity, not with judgment, just with that quiet certainty, made the words die in her throat. Fine, she said finally. But I'm helping. Didn't expect otherwise. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. He rode into town and came back with lumber strapped to the side of a horse she'd never seen him with before. A bay mare, well kept, the kind of horse that cost money. She didn't ask where he got it, didn't ask how he paid for the wood, just rolled up her sleeves and got to work. He measured and cut. She held boards steady while he hammered. The dogs watched from a distance, curious but cautious, their breath steaming in the cold air. He worked like a man who'd done this before. Not just once or twice, but enough times that his hands knew what to do without his head having to think about it. The saw moved smooth and sure. The hammer struck clean. He didn't waste motion, didn't waste words. But every now and then, when she glanced at him, she'd catch something in his face, a tightness around his eyes, a hesitation before he lifted something heavy, like his body remembered pain and was trying not to repeat it. You hurt? She asked once when he paused too long between cuts. Old ache, he said. Nothing that matters. Everything matters when you're trying to lift a beam. He looked at her, surprised, then nodded. I'll manage. And he did. But she noticed after that he let her take more of the weight, didn't make a show of it, just shifted things so she was carrying her share, and he wasn't pretending to be stronger than he was. By the time the sun started sinking, the shed had walls that didn't leak wind, a door that latched, and a roof that wouldn't cave under snow. It wasn't beautiful, but it was solid. Clara stood back, wiping her hands on her skirt, and felt something close to pride. That'll hold, he said, setting the last of the tools down. It will. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time she saw something in his face that wasn't guarded, something soft, almost like gratitude. You're stronger than you look, he said quietly. So are you, he smiled. Not much, just a flicker at the corner of his mouth, but it was enough. Come on, she said, I'll make us something to eat. Inside the cabin, the warmth from the stove wrapped around them like a blanket. Clara put a pot of stew on to heat, leftovers from 2 days ago, stretched thin with water and a handful of dried beans, and sliced bread while he washed his hands in the basin by the door. He moved careful in the small space, like he was aware of how much room he took up and didn't want to crowd her. When the stew was ready, she ladled it into 2 bowls and set them on the table. He sat across from her, same as before, and they ate without talking. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence was comfortable, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. Outside, the light faded to blue, then gray, then black. The dogs scratched at the shed door and settled in for the night. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters, but inside it was warm and still. After a while, Clara noticed he was staring at the wall beside the stove, at the small shelf there where she kept a few things, a tin cup, a candle stub, a wooden bird no bigger than her thumb. "Where'd you get that?" he asked, nodding toward the bird. She glanced at it. "My father made it. Long time ago." "He teach you to carve?" "No. He died before I was old enough to hold a knife steady." He nodded slow, like he understood, like he'd lost people too. "It's good work," he said quietly. "It was all he left me. That and this place, not a bad inheritance." She looked at him surprised. Most people saw the cabin as barely standing, saw the land as barely worth keeping. But he said it like he meant it, like he saw something in it that mattered. "You got family?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time, so long she thought maybe he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Had? Not anymore? Not in any way that counts." She wanted to ask more, wanted to know what that meant, but the weight in his voice told her not to, so she let it sit. After they ate, he stood to go, but before he reached the door he paused, reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. He set it on the table. "What's that?" she asked. "Something I've been working on." She unwrapped it slow. Inside was a carving, a dog, small, no bigger than her palm, but detailed. Every line of fur, every curve of muscle, every fold of ear carved with care. It looked like the one with the limp, the one that had trusted him first. Clara stared at it, her throat tight. "You made this? Seemed right? It's beautiful." He didn't say anything, just touched the brim of his hat and stepped toward the door. "Wait," she said. He stopped. She stood, walked over to the shelf, and picked up the wooden bird. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, its history. Then she held it out to him. "I can't take that," he said. "You gave me something. I'm giving you something back. That's your father's. And now it's yours." He looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. Then, slow and careful, he took the bird, held it like it was fragile, like it mattered. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded, and then he was gone, out into the cold and the dark, the bird tucked safe in his pocket. Clara stood in the doorway and watched him go, watched his shadow disappear into the night. Then she went back inside, closed the door, and set the carved dog on the shelf where the bird had been. It fit. The days that followed folded into one another like pages in a book, each one similar, each one necessary. He came at dawn. They fed the animals. He worked on something that needed fixing, the fence, the gate, the roof of the cabin where shingles had blown loose. She worked beside him, learning as she went, her hands growing steadier, her confidence growing with them. And in the evenings when the work was done, they sat by the fire, not always talking, sometimes just sitting, him with his knife and a piece of wood, her with her mending or a book she'd read a dozen times but still loved. The dogs curled at their feet, warm and full and content. One night she looked up from her mending and saw him carving again. Another animal, a cat this time, lean and watchful. "You're good at that," she said. "Had a lot of time to practice." "Where?" He paused. Looked at the half-finished cat in his hand. Places where sitting still was better than moving. "Prison?" He glanced at her, and for a second she thought she'd crossed a line, but then he shook his head. "No, just places I didn't want to be." She nodded, didn't push. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked after a while. "This place? Any of it?" She thought about that, thought about the town that whispered, the land that fought her, the winters that came too soon and stayed too long. "Every day," she said honestly. "But then I think about them." She nodded toward the dogs. "And I stay, that's a good reason. Is it? Better than most?" She looked at him, at the way the firelight caught the scar on his face, at the way his hands moved sure and steady, even when his eyes looked tired. "You ever think about staying?" she asked. He went still. The knife stopped moving. "In one place, you mean?" "Yeah." He didn't answer right away, just stared into the fire, his jaw tight, his eyes distant. "I used to," he said finally. "Long time ago." "What happened?" "Life." It wasn't an answer, but it was enough. They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling, the wind outside singing low and lonesome. And when he finally stood to leave, he set the half-finished cat on the table. "For you," he said, "when it's done, you don't have to. I know." And then he was gone again, out into the dark, leaving only warmth behind. A week later, the first real snow came. Not a dusting this time, a storm. The kind that turned the world white and swallowed the horizon. It started in the afternoon and didn't stop. By evening, the drifts were knee-high, and the wind howled like something wounded. Clara stood at the window, watching it come down, worry gnawing at her chest. He hadn't come that morning, hadn't come all day. She told herself it was fine, told herself he'd found shelter somewhere, told herself he knew how to take care of himself. But as the night wore on and the storm got worse, the worry grew teeth. She fed the dogs in the shed, made sure they had water, then came back inside and paced. The fire burned low, the wind screamed, and still, he didn't come. By midnight, she couldn't take it anymore. She pulled on her coat, wrapped her scarf tight, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit her like a fist. The snow stung her face, and the wind tried to push her back. But she kept walking toward the sycamore, toward the place where she knew he camped. "Hello?" she called, but the wind tore the word away. She kept going, stumbling through drifts, her lantern swinging wild, and then she saw it. A shape, dark against the white, a lean-to, built low and tight against the base of the tree, and inside, a glow. She dropped to her knees and pulled back the canvas flap. He was there, alive, awake, sitting with a blanket around his shoulders and a small fire burning in a ring of stones. He looked up at her, surprised. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice rough with cold. "Looking for you, you fool." "I'm fine. You're freezing." "I've been colder." She stared at him, at the too thin blanket, at the fire that barely gave off heat, at the way his hands shook even though he was trying to hide it. "Come on," she said. "What? You're coming inside." "I'm not. I don't care what you're not. You're freezing and I've got a fire and a floor. Now come on before we both die out here." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, slow and stiff, he nodded. Inside, she sat him by the stove and wrapped another blanket around him. His lips were pale, his fingers clumsy. She made him drink hot water with honey, then stoked the fire until the room glowed warm. The dogs pressed close, adding their heat, and slowly the shaking stopped. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "Yes, I did." "Why?" She looked at him, at this man who'd fixed her shed and carved her gifts and asked for nothing. This man who'd stood in a storm for her once, and never asked why she did the same. "Because somebody has to," she said. He smiled then, a real smile, soft and tired and grateful. "Thank you, Clara." It was the first time he'd said her name, and it sounded like home. Outside the storm raged on, but inside, by the fire with the dogs asleep and the world held at bay, there was warmth, there was quiet, there was peace. And when the first snow fell, she realized he hadn't vanished. He had simply moved closer. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of white silence, of snow piling against the cabin walls, of the world shrinking down to just the glow of the fire and the sound of breathing. Clara gave him the bed. He refused at first, said he'd sleep on the floor, but she wouldn't hear it. So, he took the bed, and she took the chair by the stove, wrapped in blankets, dozing when she could. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. The storm said everything, howling its warnings, rattling the shutters, reminding them both how small they were against the weight of winter. But, on the morning of the 4th day, the wind stopped. Clara woke to silence, real silence, the kind that felt too big after all that noise. She stood and opened the door, and the world outside was transformed. Everything white and clean and new, the sun already burning bright in a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The man was already awake, standing in the doorway of the shed, checking on the dogs. They spilled out around him, barking and leaping through the drifts, their tails whipping joy into the cold air. Clara pulled her coat on and walked out to meet him. "They're all right," he said before she could ask. "Good." He looked at her, his face serious. "I should go, where?" "Back to my camp. Clear out before the next one hits. Or you could stay." The words were out before she'd really thought about them. But once they were said, she didn't take them back. He stared at her. "Clara, there's space in the shed. We could partition it. Half for the dogs, half for you. It's warmer than that lean-to, and you'd be close if something needed fixing. People will talk. People already talk. It'll be worse." She met his eyes. Let them. For a long moment he didn't say anything. Just looked at her like he was trying to figure out if she meant it, if she understood what she was offering. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, if you're sure." "I'm sure." Something passed between them then. Not spoken, not even acknowledged, just a quiet understanding that the line between stranger and something more had shifted, and neither of them was sorry for it. "I'll need to go into town," he said. "Get supplies. Nails, hinges, maybe some canvas for the partition. I'll come with you. You don't have to. I know. He looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. They rode into Dry Hollow just after noon. Clara drove the wagon, and he sat beside her, his hat pulled low, his coat buttoned to the throat. The dogs stayed behind, warm in the shed, and the world was quiet except for the crunch of snow under the wheels and the occasional call of a crow. The town looked smaller in winter, lonelier. Half the buildings were shuttered, their owners gone south or east or just gone. The ones that remained stood gray and tired, smoke curling from chimneys, icicles hanging from eaves like teeth. They pulled up outside the general store, and Clara felt the shift immediately. Eyes in windows, faces turning, whispers starting before they'd even climbed down from the wagon. She ignored it, walked inside with him following a step behind, and the warmth of the store wrapped around them along with the smell of coffee and dried tobacco and old wood. Mrs. Calloway was behind the counter. Her husband, a thin man with a mustache that drooped past his chin, stood beside her. Both of them looked up when the door opened. Both of them went still. "Morning," Clara said, her voice steady. Mrs. Calloway's mouth pinched. "Clara, need some supplies? I'm sure you do." The tone was sharp, pointed. Clara felt the man beside her shift, just slightly, but he didn't say anything. She walked to the counter and started listing what they needed. Nails, hinges, canvas, rope, misses. Calloway wrote it down with sharp, angry strokes, her pen scratching loud in the quiet. When Clara finished, Mrs. Calloway looked up, not at her, at him. "You paying for this?" she asked. "I am," Clara said quickly. "Wasn't asking you." The man stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and set a coin on the counter. Not silver this time. Gold. The same kind Clara had found under the plate. Mrs. Calloway stared at it, then at him. Where did Drifter get money like that? "Does it spend?" he asked, his voice low and even. "That's not the point." "Then what is?" Mrs. Calloway's face went red. "The point is we don't know you, don't know where you came from or what you're running from, and we don't take kindly to strangers stirring up trouble. I haven't stirred anything. You're living on her land. People notice. People should mind their business." The air in the store went tight. Mr. Calloway shifted behind the counter, his hand moving toward something Clara couldn't see. She stepped forward, putting herself between them. "We're just here for supplies," she said firmly. "Nothing more." Mrs. Calloway looked at her then, and there was something ugly in her eyes, something that looked like satisfaction. "You know what they're saying about you, Clara?" "I don't care. They're saying you've taken up with a criminal, a thief. Maybe worse, they're wrong. Are they?" Clara felt her hands curl into fists, felt anger rising hot in her chest. But before she could say anything, the man spoke. "Give us the supplies," he said quietly. "Keep the change." He set another coin on the counter. Then another, more than enough to cover what they'd asked for, more than enough to make Mrs. Calloway's eyes go wide. She stared at the coins, then at him. Then, reluctantly, she started gathering the supplies. They left without another word. Outside, the cold hit like a slap. Clara loaded the supplies into the wagon, her hands shaking, not from cold but from fury. He stood beside her, silent, his face unreadable. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Do what?" "Pay extra. Like you're trying to prove something." "I'm not trying to prove anything. Then what are you trying to do?" He looked at her, his eyes dark and steady. "Make it easier for you." "You think money makes it easier?" "No, but it's all I got." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that wasn't true, that he'd given her more than money, more than coins left on fence posts and carvings by the fire. But the words stuck in her throat, tangled up with anger and something softer she couldn't name. They climbed into the wagon and started back, but they didn't get far. At the edge of town, near the old church, a group of men stood blocking the road. 6 of them, maybe 7, bundled in coats and hats, their breath steaming in the cold. Clara recognized some of them. The blacksmith, the saloon keeper, a ranch hand from one of the big spreads north of town, and in front of them, arms crossed, stood the sheriff. Clara pulled the wagon to a stop. The sheriff walked forward, his boots crunching in the snow. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a face like weathered stone and eyes that didn't give anything away. "Afternoon, Clara," he said. "Sheriff?" His gaze shifted to the man beside her. "And you?" The man didn't answer. just looked at him, calm and still. "Got a problem, Sheriff?" Clara asked, her voice tight. "Might be we do." He nodded toward the man. "Merchant wagon went missing 2 nights ago. Supplies meant for the northern camps. Whoever took it knew the route, knew the timing. And you think he had something to do with it? I think I don't know him. And I think he showed up right around the time things started going missing." Clara felt her heart hammering. "He's been with me every day, working my land. That's so? It is. And you can vouch for him every hour, every night?" She hesitated, just for a second, because she couldn't. Not every hour, not every night. And the sheriff saw it. "Thought so," he said. "I didn't take your wagon," the man said quietly. "Then you won't mind if we search your camp? Don't have one anymore." "Convenient. I'm staying on Clara's land, in her shed." "You want to search it?" you ask her. The sheriff looked at Clara. "That true? It is. Then I'm asking." She wanted to say no, wanted to tell him to go to hell, that he had no right, that this was her land and her choice. But she could see the men behind him, could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their hands hovered near their belts, could see that this wasn't a request. It was a warning. "Fine," she said. "Search it." The sheriff nodded. "Boys." 4 of the men stepped forward, moving past the wagon, heading toward her property. Clara started to follow, but the sheriff held up a hand. "You stay here. Won't take long." "Like hell I will." "Clara." The man's voice was low, steady. "Let them." She turned to him, furious. "They're going to tear apart." "Let them," he said again. And there was something in his eyes, something heavy, like he'd expected this, like he'd been waiting for it. So she stayed. Stood there in the cold with the wagon, and the sheriff, and the men who thought they knew better. Stood there while her hands shook, and her breath came fast and angry. Stood there while the man beside her sat silent and still, his face like stone. It took 20 minutes. When the men came back, they had nothing. No stolen goods, no evidence, just empty hands and frustrated faces. "Satisfied?" Clara asked, her voice sharp. The sheriff didn't answer, just looked at the man, looked at him long and hard, like he was trying to see through him. "You're lucky," he said finally. "Didn't need luck. This time." The sheriff turned to Clara. "You be careful, Clara. Man with money and no name is a man with something to hide. Or a man who values his privacy. Privacy and secrets aren't the same thing." He tipped his hat and walked away, the men following. They climbed onto horses, onto wagons, and rode off slow, their eyes lingering on the man beside her. When they were gone, Clara exhaled, long and shaky. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what? For that? For them? You didn't do anything. I brought you into town. I chose to come." She looked at him, at the set of his jaw, the weight in his eyes. "They're going to keep doing this. Keep pushing. I know, so why stay?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her, and his voice was soft, almost sad. "Because I don't have anywhere else worth being." Clara felt something break open in her chest, something warm and aching and terrifying. She didn't say anything, just picked up the reins and drove them home. That night, she couldn't sleep. The cabin was warm. The fire was burning. The dogs were quiet in the shed, but her mind wouldn't settle. She kept thinking about the sheriff's words, about the men blocking the road, about the way they'd looked at him, like he was already guilty, like mercy was a mistake she'd regret. And she kept thinking about the coins, the gold ones, the ones that shouldn't exist in a drifter's pocket. She got up finally, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and walked out to the shed. The partition was half built now, canvas stretched between posts, creating a small space in the corner. He'd hung a lantern there, and the light glowed soft through the fabric. She knocked on the post. "Come in," he said. She stepped inside. He was sitting on a bedroll, his back against the wall, the half-finished cat in his hands. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his face. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "No, me neither." She sat down across from him, pulling the blanket tighter. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then she said, "Who are you?" He looked at her. "You know who I am." "No. I know what you do, how you act, but I don't know who you are, where you came from, why you have gold coins and a horse that costs more than most men make in a year." He set the carving down slow. "Does it matter?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I defended you today, and I'll defend you tomorrow. But I need to know if I'm defending a lie." He flinched. just slightly. But she saw it. "I'm not lying to you," he said quietly. "Then tell me the truth." He was silent for a long time. So long she thought he might not answer. Then he exhaled, slow and heavy, and looked at the floor. "I had a life once," he said. "A name, a family, money. All the things people think matter. What happened? I gave it up. Why? Because it was killing me." He looked at her then, and his eyes were raw. "I was drowning in it, Clara. The expectations, the obligations, the people who wanted pieces of me I didn't have to give. So I left, walked away from all of it, and the first have been trying to figure out who I am without it ever since. And the coins? Old habit. Hard to shake." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I keep them to remind myself what I left behind. And why?" Clara stared at him, her heart pounding. "So you're not a drifter. Not the kind they think I am. But you're not a thief. No. And you're not dangerous. Not to you." She believed him. God help her, she believed him. "What's your name?" she asked softly. He hesitated. Then, quietly, he said, "Nathaniel. Nathaniel Mercer." "Nathaniel," she repeated, testing it, feeling it. He nodded. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because names carry weight, and I wanted to be someone who earned your trust, not someone who bought it." She looked at him, really looked, and saw the truth in his face, saw the man who'd stood in the storm, who'd fixed her shed, who'd carved small wonders by firelight, who'd sat silent while the town judged him, and never once asked her to choose his side. "You already earned it," she said. His eyes softened. "Thank you." They sat there in the quiet, the lantern flickering between them, the dogs breathing soft on the other side of the canvas. And outside, the snow began to fall again. Soft, silent, endless. But warmth has a way of drawing shadows, and Dry Hollow never let kindness go unpunished. The snow didn't stop. Day after day it fell, soft and relentless, piling higher against the cabin walls, burying the fence posts, turning the world into something white and silent and strange. Clara and Nathaniel worked through it side by side, keeping the animals fed, keeping the shed warm, keeping the cold at bay. But the town didn't forget. Clara could feel it every time she went in for supplies, the way conversation stopped when she entered, the way eyes followed her down the street, the way Mrs. Calloway counted her change twice, slow and deliberate, like she was hoping to find Clara short. And then the whispers started getting louder. She heard them in fragments, pieces, living in sin. "That man's got a past. Won't end well." She ignored them, kept her head down, kept moving forward, because what else could she do? Nathaniel was helping, the animals were surviving, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel alone. That had to count for something. But counting didn't stop the world from keeping score. It happened on a Tuesday. Clara was in town picking up flour and salt when she overheard two men talking outside the saloon. She didn't mean to listen. But their voices carried sharp and clear in the cold air. Heard it was the Harrison wagon, $300 worth of goods. Just gone. Sheriff's got no leads, nothing solid. But folks are saying, the stranger? Who else? Shows up out of nowhere, got money he shouldn't have, and suddenly wagons start disappearing. Clara's hands tightened on the flour sack. Heard Clara's letting him stay on her land. Fool woman. She's going to regret it when he robs her blind and moves on. If he hasn't already. They laughed, low and mean. Clara walked past them without a word, her jaw tight, her heart pounding. She loaded the supplies into the wagon and drove home faster than she should have, the wheels skidding on the ice-packed road. When she got back, Nathaniel was splitting wood by the shed, his breath fogging with each swing of the axe. The dogs lay nearby, watching him with sleepy eyes. He looked up when she pulled in, saw her face and set the axe down. What happened? Nothing. Clara. It's nothing, she said again, climbing down from the wagon. Just talk. He didn't believe her. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes darkened. But he didn't push. Just helped her unload the supplies, his hands steady even though she could feel the tension radiating off him. That night, he was quiet, too quiet. He sat by the fire, carving, but his hands moved slower than usual. The knife paused more often. And when she asked if he wanted more coffee, he didn't answer right away, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. Nathaniel. she said softly. He looked up. What are you thinking? He stared at the fire for a long moment. Then he set the knife down. I'm thinking I should leave. Her heart dropped. What? Before this gets worse. It's not. It is, he said, his voice low. You know it is. They're blaming me for things I didn't do, and you're paying the price for defending me. I don't care what they think. You should. Why? She leaned forward, her voice fierce. Why should I care what a bunch of small-minded, bitter people think when I know the truth? Because they can hurt you, Clara. They can make your life harder than it already is, and I won't be the reason you suffer. You're not the reason. They are. He shook his head. It doesn't matter. As long as I'm here, they'll keep circling, keep pushing, and eventually they'll push too hard and someone's going to get hurt. So you're just going to run? I'm trying to protect you. I don't need protecting. I need... She stopped, swallowed hard. I need you to stay. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Nathaniel looked at her, something breaking in his eyes. Clara. A knock at the door cut him off. Hard, urgent. They both froze. Clara stood slow, walked to the door and opened it. The sheriff stood on the other side, his face grim. Behind him, 3 other men, deputies by the look of them, stood with rifles slung loose in their hands. Evening, Clara, the sheriff said. Sheriff. Her voice was steady, but her heart was hammering. Need to talk to your friend. Nathaniel stood, moving to stand beside her. I'm right here. The sheriff looked at him, his eyes cold. Another wagon went missing last night. The Miller freight, carrying medical supplies for the northern camps. I didn't take it. Can you prove that? Can you prove I did? The sheriff's jaw tightened. Witnesses say they saw a man matching your description near the Miller place 2 days ago. What witnesses? Can't say. Then they're lying. Or you are. Nathaniel took a step forward, and Clara grabbed his arm. Don't. He stopped. But his whole body was tense, coiled like a spring. The sheriff watched him. Then he said, I'm taking you in for questioning. On what grounds? Suspicion of theft. Maybe more, depending on what we find. You already searched my camp. Found nothing. That was before another wagon disappeared. Clara stepped between them, her voice shaking but firm. He was here. With me. All night. The sheriff looked at her. You sure about that? Yes. Every hour? She hesitated. Because she'd been asleep. Because she couldn't swear to every minute. And the sheriff saw it. Thought so, he said. He nodded to the deputies. Bring him. No, Clara said, her voice breaking. You can't. Step aside, Clara. He didn't do anything. Step aside, or I'll have you arrested for obstruction. Nathaniel put a hand on her shoulder. Gentle, steady. It's all right. It's not. Let me go. He looked at her, and his eyes were calm. Too calm. Like he'd already accepted this. I'll sort it out. Nathaniel, trust me. The deputies moved forward, and Nathaniel held out his hands. They didn't cuff him, not yet, but they walked him out into the snow, surrounding him like he was dangerous. Clara stood in the doorway, shaking, watching them lead him away, watching his shadow disappear into the white. The sheriff paused before leaving. For what it's worth, Clara, I hope I'm wrong about him. You are, maybe, but hoping doesn't make it true. Then he was gone, and Clara was alone. The days after were the longest of her life. She kept working, kept feeding the animals, kept moving because if she stopped, the fear would swallow her whole. But the cabin felt empty now, too quiet. The dogs seemed to feel it too. They paced more, whined at the door, looked for him in places he used to be. She went into town every day, trying to get information, trying to see him. But the sheriff wouldn't let her. Said he was being held for questioning, said it would be over soon, said she should go home and wait. So she waited. And while she waited, the town kept talking. They said he'd confessed, said he was part of a ring of thieves working the territory, said he'd been using her land as a cover, and she'd been too foolish to see it. Clara didn't believe a word, but doubt crept in anyway, cold and insidious, because she didn't know him, not really, didn't know where he'd been before, didn't know what he'd done, didn't know if the man who'd carved small wonders by her fire was the same man who'd lived the life he said he'd left behind. On the 5th day, a newspaper arrived. She almost didn't read it, but something made her unfold it, made her scan the pages, made her stop when she saw the headline, Northern Mine Heir Presumed Dead. She stared at the words, her breath catching. The article was short, a few paragraphs about a man named Nathaniel Mercer, son of one of the wealthiest ranch and mining families in the Northern Territories, disappeared 3 years ago after a dispute with his family. Presumed dead after a mine collapse, estate divided among surviving relatives. There was a sketch, rough but recognizable. It was him. Clara's hands shook as she read it again. And again, he wasn't a drifter, wasn't a thief. He was a dead man, or he had been, until he showed up on her land. She folded the paper slow, her mind racing. If this was true, if he was really Nathaniel Mercer, then he hadn't just left his old life. He'd erased it, let people think he was dead so he could disappear. But why? She thought about the way he'd looked when he talked about his past, the weight in his voice, the pain in his eyes. She thought about the coins, the horse, the way he worked like a man trying to prove something to himself. And she thought about the sheriff's words. Man with money and no name is a man with something to hide. But hiding wasn't the same as lying, and running wasn't the same as stealing. She stood, grabbed her coat, and rode back into town. The sheriff's office was small and cold, smelling of old coffee and damp wood. Clara walked in without knocking, the newspaper clutched in her hand. The sheriff looked up from his desk, surprised. "Clara, is this him?" She slammed the paper down in front of him. He looked at it. His face went still. "Where'd you get this?" "Doesn't matter. Is it him?" The sheriff was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "We think so. You think?" "We sent a wire north. Got confirmation this morning. Nathaniel Mercer, declared dead 3 years ago." "Then why is he in your jail?" "Because dead men don't just come back without a reason. And we need to know what his is," he told me. He left because he was drowning in that life, because it was killing him, or because he stole something and needed to disappear. He's not a thief. You don't know that. "Yes, I do," the sheriff sighed, rubbing his face. "Clara, I want to believe you, but the timing doesn't add up. He shows up, and wagons start disappearing, and now we find out he's got a fortune waiting for him up north, and he's been living like a drifter? That doesn't strike you as strange?" "No, it strikes me as a man who wanted a different life, or a man who's running from the law." "Then prove it," Clara said, her voice shaking. "Show me evidence. Show me something that says he did what you're accusing him of, because all I've seen is suspicion and fear, and a town full of people who'd rather blame a stranger than admit they don't know the answer." The sheriff stared at her. Then he stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the snow-covered street. "The wagons turned up," he said quietly. Clara froze. "What?" "Found them this morning. Hidden in a canyon 20 miles east. Goods mostly intact. And there were tracks. Boot prints, horse prints. Doesn't match anything we found at his camp." Her heart leapt. "So he didn't do it." "Looks that way." "Then let him go." The sheriff turned to face her. "I will. But Clara, he lied to you. About who he is. About where he came from. You sure you want a man like that on your land?" She met his eyes, steady and sure. "He didn't lie. He just didn't tell me everything. And that's his right." The sheriff shook his head. "You're a fool, Clara. Maybe. But I'd rather be a fool with a clear conscience than a coward with a clean reputation." She turned and walked out, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. But when she got back to the cabin, Nathaniel wasn't there. The shed was empty, the partition gone, his bedroll, his lantern, the carvings he'd been working on, all of it gone. The only thing left was a note, pinned to the post where the canvas had hung. It said, "I'm sorry. You deserved better than a ghost." Clara stared at it, her vision blurring. And then she crumpled to the floor, the note clutched in her fist, and let the tears come. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft, endless, like the world itself wanted to bury what had been lost. The days blurred together after that. Clara fed the animals, mended the fence, kept the fire burning, but the work felt hollow now, empty. The dogs sensed it. They stayed close, pressing against her legs, watching her with worried eyes. She didn't go into town, didn't want to hear the whispers, the satisfaction in their voices, the "I told you so's" she knew were waiting. She just stayed on her land, alone, and tried not to think about the way his hands had moved when he carved, the way his voice had sounded when he said her name, the way the cabin had felt when he was there, not just warmer, but alive. One evening she walked out to the sycamore. The sun was setting, turning the snow pink and gold, and the tree cast a long shadow across the white ground. She stood there, looking at the place where his lean-to had been, at the marks in the snow that were already fading. and she whispered his name. Just once, like a prayer, like a goodbye. The wind carried it away, and Clara turned and walked back to the cabin, her footsteps crunching in the snow, her shadow stretching long behind her. Inside, she lit the fire, fed the dogs, made herself eat even though the food tasted like nothing. And when the darkness came, she sat by the window and stared out at the empty yard, at the shed with its half-finished walls, at the sycamore standing alone against the sky. She whispered his name to the firelight and kept feeding those who could not repay her, because that's what mercy looked like, even when it broke your heart. But sometimes love returns not as a man, but as a sound of hooves on thawing earth. Spring came slow that year. The snow melted in patches, leaving the ground muddy and raw, and the creek ran high and fast with runoff. The days grew longer, warmer, and the world started waking up. Birds returning, grass pushing through the mud, the wind losing its teeth. Clara worked through it all. She reinforced the shed walls alone, her hands blistered and aching. She planted a small garden behind the cabin, turning the soil by herself, her back screaming by day's end. She fed the animals, 8 of them now. 2 more strays had found their way to her gate, and she did it all in silence. The town had stopped talking about her mostly. They'd moved on to other scandals, other whispers, but she could still feel their judgment when she went in for supplies. Could still see it in the way Mrs. Calloway counted her change, in the way men tipped their hats but didn't meet her eyes. She was the woman who'd been fooled, the woman who'd defended a liar, the woman who'd let her heart overrule her sense. She didn't correct them, didn't explain, just bought what she needed and went home, because the truth was, she didn't know if they were wrong. Nathaniel had left, without a word, without a fight. Just disappeared like smoke, leaving only a note and an empty space where he used to be. And Clara was tired of defending ghosts. It was late April when the rain came. Not a storm, not the violent, angry kind that tore through in summer. Just a soft, steady rain that started at dawn and didn't stop. The kind that soaked into everything, turned the roads to rivers, and made the whole world smell like earth and growth and new things. Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching it fall, her arms crossed over her chest. The dogs were inside, dry and warm, and the fire crackled behind her, but she didn't move, just stood there, letting the sound of the rain fill the silence. That's when she heard it. Hooves. At first she thought she'd imagined it, but then it came again, steady, deliberate, moving through the rain. She stepped out onto the porch, squinting through the gray curtain of water. A rider was coming up the road, slow, unhurried. The horse's coat dark with rain, the rider's hat pulled low. Clara's heart stuttered. She told herself it wasn't him. Told herself she was seeing things. Told herself not to hope. But the dogs knew. They bolted past her, barking, not with alarm, but with joy. They ran through the mud, tails wagging, and when they reached the rider, they leapt and spun and whined like he'd been gone forever. The rider dismounted, and Clara's breath caught. It was him, Nathaniel, but not the man she remembered. Not the drifter in worn clothes and a battered hat. This man wore a coat of fine leather, dark and well cut, the kind that cost more than most men made in a season. His boots were polished despite the mud. His hat was new, the brim sharp and clean, and on his chest, catching the gray light, was a silver pin, a family crest, ornate and unmistakable. He looked like money, like power, like everything he'd said he'd left behind. The dogs swarmed him, and he crouched down, one hand on each of their heads, his face soft in a way that broke Clara's heart all over again. Then he looked up, and their eyes met. For a long moment neither of them moved. The rain fell between them, steady and relentless, and the world held its breath. Then he stood, walked toward her, slow, steady, like he was afraid she might disappear if he moved too fast. He stopped at the base of the porch steps, water streaming down his face, his coat, his hands. "Clara," he said, and his voice was rough, raw. She didn't answer. Couldn't. Her throat was too tight. "I'm sorry," he said. Still she said nothing. "I shouldn't have left. I thought—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I thought it would be easier for you if I just disappeared, if you didn't have to choose between me and this town. But I was wrong. You think?" Her voice came out sharper than she intended, laced with months of hurt and anger and sleepless nights. He flinched. "I know. You left a note, Nathaniel. A note. After everything, after I defended you, after I stood between you and that mob, Her voice broke. You left a note. I know, he said again, quieter this time. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Then why did you? Because I was afraid. The words came out like a confession. Afraid that staying would ruin you, that my past would destroy whatever future you could have here, that you'd wake up one day and realize you'd tied yourself to a man who didn't deserve you. That wasn't your choice to make. I know. You should have stayed. You should have fought. I know. He took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. But I'm here now, and I'm not running anymore. Why not? Because I finally understand what I was running from. He gestured at himself, at the fine coat, the silver pin. This isn't me. It never was. I thought leaving it behind meant I had to disappear entirely, had to become no one. But that's not freedom. That's just another kind of prison. He climbed the steps slow, stopping just a few feet from her. You asked me once why I stayed, he said quietly, and I told you it was because I didn't have anywhere else worth being. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Then what is? I stayed because you saw me, not the name, not the money, not the mistakes, just me. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. You still left. I did, and I'm sorrier for that than I can say. He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope, thick and official looking. But I'm hoping you'll let me try to make it right. She looked at the envelope, then at him. What is that? The deed to your land. Free and clear. No debts, no liens. It's yours, Clara. No one can take it from you. Her breath caught. I can't. Yes, you can. And there's more. He pulled out another document. Funds for the refuge. Enough to build proper shelters, hire help if you need it, buy feed for however many strays you want to take in. It's already arranged. The bank has the papers. Nathaniel, I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said quickly. I'm not even asking you to let me stay. I'm just trying to do what I should have done from the beginning. Use what I have to help, not to hide. Clara stared at him, at the rain streaming down his face, at the way his hands shook slightly as he held out the papers. Why now? She asked. Because I went back, he said. Went north, faced my family, faced the lawyers and the estate and all the things I'd been running from. And I realized that walking away didn't make me free. It just made me lost. He paused. But you weren't lost. You knew exactly who you were, what you believed in, what you were willing to fight for. And I wanted to be that kind of person too. So you came back. So I came back. He smiled, sad and hopeful. To the only place that ever felt like home. Clara looked at the papers in his hands, then at his face, then at the dogs, still circling his feet, their tails wagging, their eyes bright. And she thought about the nights she'd spent alone, wondering if she'd been a fool. Thought about the way the cabin had felt empty without him. Thought about the carvings she still kept on the shelf, the wooden dog and the half-finished cat, and the way her hands had traced them in the dark. Thought about mercy, and what it meant to offer it even when it hurt. Come inside, she said finally. He looked at her, surprised. Clara, you're soaking wet and we need to talk, so come inside. He hesitated, then he nodded. Inside, she made coffee while he stood by the fire, steam rising from his coat. The dogs pressed close to him, and he scratched their ears absently, his eyes following her as she moved through the small space. When the coffee was ready, she handed him a cup and sat at the table. He sat across from her, the same place he'd always sat, and for a moment it felt like nothing had changed, but everything had. Tell me what happened, she said. All of it. So he did. He told her about going north, about walking back into the life he'd left behind, about standing in his father's study and facing the lawyers who'd declared him dead, about the shock on his family's faces, the accusations, the questions he couldn't answer. He told her about the estate, the money, the business holdings that had been divided up and were now tangled in legal disputes, about the pressure to stay, to take his place, to be the son and heir they'd expected him to be. And he told her about the moment he realized he couldn't do it, couldn't go back to being that person, couldn't pretend that the last 3 years hadn't changed him. They wanted me to stay, he said quietly, offered me everything. Control of the company, a seat on the board, a house in the city, everything I'd walked away from. You said no, I said no. He looked at her. Because none of it mattered if I couldn't be the person I'd become. The person you helped me see I could be. Clara's throat tightened. I didn't do anything. You did everything. He set his cup down, his hands flat on the table. You showed me what it looks like to care about something more than yourself, to give without expecting anything back. To fight for what's right even when the world tells you you're wrong. He smiled, soft and sad. You showed me mercy, Clara, real mercy, and I didn't know how much I needed that until I found it here. She looked at him, at the man who'd come back through the rain, and felt something shift in her chest. Something warm and aching and terrifyingly hopeful. What do you want, Nathaniel? She asked quietly. I want to stay. If you'll let me, and if I don't, then I'll go. And you'll never see me again. He paused. But I'll leave the papers anyway, because you earned them, and because this place, what you're building here, it's worth protecting. She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the coffee in her cup, at the way the light caught the surface. They'll talk, she said finally. The town. They'll say I took you back because of the money. Let them. They'll say I'm a fool. Then you'll be a fool with a warm shed and a full feed store. She almost smiled. Almost. What about you? She asked. What do you get out of this? He looked at her, and his eyes were clear. Honest. A chance to be someone worth being. A chance to do something that matters. A chance to... He stopped, swallowed. A chance to be near the only person who ever made me feel like I was enough. Clara felt her eyes burn, felt the walls she'd built over the long, lonely months start to crack. I was so angry at you, she whispered. I know. I wanted to hate you. I know that too. But I couldn't. A tear slipped down her cheek. I tried. God, I tried, but I couldn't. He reached across the table, slow and careful, and took her hand. His fingers were warm, rough, familiar. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said softly. Not yet. Just give me a chance to earn it. She looked at their hands, at the way his thumb brushed across her knuckles. Then she looked at his face, at the man who'd left and the man who'd returned, and realized they were the same person. Just braver now. More whole. All right, she said. His eyes widened. All right? All right. She squeezed his hand. But you're sleeping in the shed, and you're doing your share of the work. And if you ever leave another note, I won't, he said quickly. I swear. Good. They sat there in the quiet, hands joined across the table, the rain drumming on the roof, the fire crackling behind them, and outside, the world kept waking up. The grass growing greener, the creek running clear, the sky beginning to break open, just a little, letting through the first pale light of sun. The next morning, Clara woke to the sound of hammering. She dressed quickly and went outside, and found Nathaniel already at work. He'd changed into his old clothes, the worn shirt, the patched pants, and he was reinforcing the shed, adding the supports she'd struggled with alone. The dogs lay in the sun nearby, content and lazy. Clara watched him for a moment, then walked over. You didn't have to start so early, wanted to. He looked at her, squinting against the morning light. Figured I had some catching up to do. She smiled. Just a little. I suppose you do. They worked together through the morning, falling back into the rhythm they'd had before. He measured and cut. She held and hammered. And when the sun climbed high and hot, they took a break in the shade of the sycamore. I heard what they said about me, Nathaniel said after a while. After I left, I figured. They thought I stole. From you. I know. I'm sorry you had to hear that. I'm sorry you had to leave thinking I believed it. He looked at her, something soft in his eyes. Did you believe it? She thought about that. About the doubt that had crept in during the long, lonely nights. About the newspaper article and the questions it raised. For a minute, she admitted. Maybe two. But not for long. Why not? Because I know mercy when I see it. And I know cruelty too. She met his eyes. And you were never cruel. Just scared. He nodded slowly. Thank you for that. For what? For seeing the difference. They sat in silence. After that, watching the dogs play, watching the clouds drift slow across the blue sky. And when the afternoon came, and the work resumed, Clara realized something. The emptiness was gone. The cabin didn't feel hollow anymore. The shed didn't feel lonely, and the land, her land, free and clear now, felt like it could hold something bigger than survival. It felt like it could hold hope. By evening, word had spread. Clara saw them from the window, a small group of townspeople standing at the edge of her property looking uncertain. The sheriff was with them. So was Mrs. Calloway. and a few others she recognized. She stepped out onto the porch, Nathaniel beside her. The sheriff walked forward, slow and deliberate, his hands held loose at his sides. "Evening, Clara," he said. "Sheriff." He looked at Nathaniel. "Heard you came back." "I did. Also heard you cleared things up. With the wagon thefts?" "We found the real thieves 2 weeks ago," the sheriff said. "Caught them trying to fence the goods in the next county." "You were right, Clara. He had nothing to do with it." Clara felt Nathaniel's hand brush against hers, just briefly, a silent acknowledgement. "I know," she said simply. The sheriff nodded, looked uncomfortable. "Some of us," he glanced back at the group, "some of us wanted to apologize for the way we treated you both, for the accusations, for not giving you the benefit of the doubt. You were protecting your town," Nathaniel said quietly. "I understand that. Still, we were wrong. And we're sorry." Mrs. Calloway stepped forward then, her face tight but sincere. "We heard what you did, with the land, the refuge funds. That's generous." "It's necessary," Nathaniel said. "It's more than that." The sheriff cleared his throat. "If you're serious about staying, about helping Clara build something here, then we'd like to help too." Clara blinked, surprised. "Help how?" "Labor, materials, whatever you need. We'll donate time supplies. Make this place what it should be." She looked at Nathaniel. He looked back at her, and she saw the question in his eyes. "What do you want?" She turned back to the sheriff, to the townspeople standing awkward and hopeful at her gate. "All right," she said. "But not for me, for them." She nodded toward the dogs. "And for any others that come. This isn't about charity, it's about doing what's right." "Understood," the sheriff said, and he almost smiled. "We'll start next week." They left after that, filing back toward town, their voices low and thoughtful. When they were gone, Clara turned to Nathaniel. "You did this," she said. "We did this." "No. You came back. You faced them. You showed them." "I showed them what you've been showing me all along," he said gently. "That mercy isn't weakness. That kindness isn't foolish. And that sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do." Clara felt tears prick her eyes again. But this time, they were different. Not sad, not angry, just full. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. "Thank you," he said softly, "for giving me a second chance. Thank you for coming back." They stood there on the porch, the sun sinking low, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber and hope. And when the first stars began to appear, soft and distant, Clara realized something. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was he. And when spring broke through the clouds, the woman who once knelt in mud stood beside him in sunlight. The work began the following Monday. They came at dawn, men with wagons full of lumber, women with baskets of food, children running alongside with hammers too big for their hands and eager smiles. The sheriff was there, sleeves rolled up, ready to dig post holes. Mrs. Calloway brought her husband and 3 nephews, all of them strong-backed and willing. Even the blacksmith came, hauling iron hinges and brackets he'd forged himself. Clara stood on the porch and watched them arrive one by one, until her yard was full of people and purpose. Nathaniel stood beside her, his hand resting light on the small of her back. "Didn't think they'd actually come," she whispered. "People surprise you," he said. "When you give them a chance." The sheriff walked up, tipping his hat. "Where do you want us to start?" Clara looked at Nathaniel. He nodded toward the field beyond the shed, where the ground sloped gentle toward the creek. "There," he said. "We'll build the main shelter there, big enough for 20, maybe 30 animals, separate stalls for the sick ones, a storage room for feed, and a covered area where they can get out of the weather." The sheriff whistled, low. "That's ambitious." "It's necessary," Clara said, echoing Nathaniel's words from the night before. "Then let's get to it." They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. The sound of hammers rang out across the land, steady and sure. Saws bit through lumber. Voices called out measurements, instructions, jokes that made the children laugh. The dogs wove through the workers, tails wagging, investigating every new face, every new smell. Clara moved between groups, offering water, checking progress, answering questions. But mostly she just watched, her heart full, her throat tight with something she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe, or wonder, or maybe just the realization that she wasn't fighting alone anymore. Nathaniel worked alongside the men, his fine coat long since discarded, his shirt damp with sweat. He lifted beams, drove nails, measured twice, and cut once. And when one of the younger men made a mistake, he didn't criticize, just showed him how to fix it, patient and kind. Clara watched him and saw the man he'd been trying to become all along. Not the heir, not the drifter, just a man who understood the value of honest work and honest company. By the time the sun started sinking, the frame of the main shelter was up, skeletal but strong, its bones reaching toward the sky like a promise. The workers gathered their tools, their families, their tired smiles. "We'll be back next week," the sheriff said, wiping his brow. "Finish the walls, get the roof on." "I don't know how to thank you," Clara said. "Don't need thanks. Just keep doing what you're doing." He glanced at the dogs, at the framework rising behind her. "World needs more of this. More people like you." When they were gone, Clara and Nathaniel stood in the quiet, looking at what had been built. "It's really happening," she said softly. "It is. I never thought—" She stopped, swallowed. "I never thought anyone would care." He turned to her, his eyes warm in the fading light. "They care because you showed them how. Showed them that caring matters." She looked up at him, and something passed between them. Something unspoken but understood. He leaned down, slow and careful, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. His lips brushed hers, gentle as a question, and when she kissed him back, it felt like an answer, like a promise, like the beginning of something neither of them had known they were looking for. When they pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Clara," he whispered. Her breath caught. "Nathaniel, you don't have to say it back. I just needed you to know." "I love you too," she said, and the words felt like light. "I think I have for a while now," he smiled then, a real smile, full and bright and unguarded, and Clara realized she'd never seen him look so free. The weeks that followed unfolded like a dream. The shelter took shape, piece by piece. Walls went up. A roof was laid, stalls were built, each one sturdy and clean. A storage room was added, then a small office where Clara could keep records, track the animals, manage supplies. And as the refuge grew, so did the number of strays. Word spread, carried by travelers, by merchants, by children who whispered stories about the woman on Mercy Hill who took in the lost and broken. Dogs came first, then cats, then a horse with a shattered leg that the vet said should be put down. Clara took it in, and Nathaniel spent 3 months nursing it back to health. By summer, the refuge was full, alive, a place where animals who'd been cast aside found safety, warmth, and second chances, just like the people who ran it. One evening in late June, Clara stood on the hill overlooking the refuge, watching the sun sink low over the plains. The sky was streaked with gold and pink and soft purple, and the air smelled like grass and wildflowers and home. Nathaniel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her close. "Tired?" he asked, a little, "Good tired or bad tired?" "Good tired." She leaned back against him, "The best kind." They stood in silence, watching the light fade, watching the first stars prick through the deepening blue. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. "Next? After this, when the refuge is established, when we've got help, systems in place. What do you want then?" She thought about that. Thought about the life she'd been living before he came, small and lonely and just surviving. And she thought about the life she had now, full and messy and beautiful. "I want this," she said simply. "I want to keep doing this, keep helping, keep building." She turned in his arms, looking up at him. "With you?" His eyes softened. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." He kissed her then, slow and deep, and the world fell away until there was nothing but him and her and the endless sky above. When they pulled apart, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. "I made you something," he said. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a carving, a woman kneeling in the dirt, her hands outstretched, a dog pressed against her side. It was small, no bigger than her palm, but every detail was perfect. The fold of her skirt, the curve of her shoulders, the gentle tilt of her head. It was her, the night they met, the night the storm came. "Nathaniel," she breathed. "I wanted to remember," he said quietly. The moment everything changed, she looked at the carving, at the woman who'd been so alone, so tired, so sure that no one was watching. and she thought about the man who'd stood in the shadows, who'd seen her kindness and been changed by it. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on me." She kissed him again, soft and sure, and when she pulled back she was smiling. "Come on," she said, taking his hand. "Let's go home." Autumn came with a burst of color. The cottonwoods along the creek turned gold, and the sycamore blazed yellow against the blue sky. The air grew crisp, the mornings cold, and the refuge prepared for winter. But this time, they were ready. The shelter was finished, insulated and warm. The feed storage was full, and Clara had hired 2 young men from town to help with the daily work, freeing her and Nathaniel to focus on the animals who needed extra care. One October morning, as Clara was checking on a new arrival, a blind cat someone had left tied to the gate, a wagon pulled up the drive. She didn't recognize it at first, but when the driver climbed down, her breath caught. It was a woman, older, gray-haired, with a face lined by sun and hardship, and beside her, holding her hand, was a little girl no more than 6. "Are you Clara?" the woman asked. "I am. We heard about what you're doing here. Heard you take in strays. Animals that nobody else wants." "That's right." The woman looked down at the little girl, then back at Clara. "I was wondering if you'd take in one more." Clara frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "My daughter, this girl's mother, she died 3 months ago, and I'm too old, too sick to care for a child. I've got no family left, no money, and the orphanage in town," her voice broke, "they're full. They said they'd take her, but not for another 6 months, and I don't have 6 months." Clara's heart clenched. "I'm not. This isn't a place for children. It's for animals. I know. But people are animals too, aren't they? When they've got nowhere else to go." The woman's voice was desperate now. "Please, I've heard the stories about how you don't turn anyone away, how you help the ones no one else will." Clara looked at the little girl. She had dark hair and wide eyes, and a grip on her grandmother's hand that looked like it might never let go. "What's your name?" Clara asked gently. The girl was quiet for a moment. Then, softly, she said, "Lily, Lily." Clara crouched down so they were eye level. "Do you like animals, Lily?" The girl nodded. "We've got a lot of them here. Dogs and cats and horses. They all need taking care of. Feeding and brushing and playing with. Do you think you could help with that?" Lily looked at her grandmother, then back at Clara. "I think so." Clara stood, her mind racing. She looked back toward the cabin where Nathaniel was working in the office. Then she looked at the woman, at the desperation in her face, at the little girl who deserved better than being shuffled from place to place. And she thought about mercy, about what it really meant. "All right," she said. The woman gasped. "Really? Really? She can stay until we figure something out, until we find her a proper home." "You're her proper home," the woman said, tears streaming down her face. "I can feel it. I know it." Clara wasn't sure about that, wasn't sure about any of this, but she nodded anyway. The woman knelt and hugged Lily tight, whispering things Clara couldn't hear. Then she stood, kissed the girl's forehead, and climbed back into the wagon. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. "Thank you for being the kind of person the world needs." And then she was gone. Clara stood there with Lily, the 2 of them watching the wagon disappear down the road. "Are you scared?" Clara asked. Lily nodded. "Me too," Clara admitted. "But we'll figure it out together, all right?" Lily looked up at her, and slowly she nodded again. Clara took her hand and led her toward the cabin. Nathaniel was sitting at the desk when they walked in, surrounded by papers and ledgers. He looked up, saw the little girl, and his eyes went wide. "Clara, this is Lily," Clara said. "She's going to be staying with us for a while, staying—" He stopped, looked at the girl, then at Clara. "What happened?" Clara explained, quick and quiet, while Lily stood by the door, her eyes taking in everything. The fire, the carvings on the shelf, the dogs watching her from their beds. When Clara finished, Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, walked over to Lily and crouched down. "You like dogs?" he asked. Lily nodded. "Good, because we've got about 15 of them, and they're going to love you." Lily's face, which had been tight and scared, softened just a little. Nathaniel looked up at Clara, and in his eyes she saw the same thing she felt, fear and hope, and the quiet understanding that their lives had just changed in a way they couldn't predict, but also the certainty that they wouldn't turn away, because that's what mercy looked like, even when it was hard, even when it was terrifying, even when you had no idea what you were doing. You opened the door anyway. The months that followed were chaos. Lily was quiet at first, watchful, moving through the refuge like she was afraid to take up space. But slowly, she began to unfold. She helped feed the animals, learned their names, sat with the ones who were sick or scared, and whispered to them in a voice so soft Clara could barely hear. And the animals loved her. They gathered around her like she was one of them, a small, gentle creature who understood what it meant to be lost. Clara and Nathaniel stumbled through it, made mistakes, learned as they went. Nathaniel taught Lily how to carve, and her small hands proved surprisingly steady. Clara taught her how to cook, how to mend, how to read the weather in the shape of the clouds, and at night, when Lily was asleep in the small bed they'd built for her in the corner of the cabin, Clara and Nathaniel would sit by the fire and marvel at how much their world had grown. "We're not going to give her up, are we?" Nathaniel said one night. "No," Clara said simply. "We're not good." He smiled. "Because I think she's ours now. I think we're hers." He took her hand, and they sat in the quiet, watching the fire burn low, listening to the soft sound of Lily's breathing. And Clara thought about the woman she'd been, the one who'd knelt in the mud and fed the strays because no one else would. And she thought about the woman she'd become, the one who'd built a refuge, who'd loved a man who'd been lost, who'd opened her home to a child who had nowhere else to go. And she realized that mercy didn't just save the ones who received it. It saved the ones who gave it too. Spring came again, softer and sweeter than the year before. The wildflowers returned, spilling across the hill in waves of purple and yellow and white. The refuge thrived, animals coming and going, some staying, some finding new homes, all of them loved. And on a morning in late April, Clara stood on the hill where they'd buried the first dog she'd ever rescued, the one with the limp, the one that had trusted Nathaniel first. Nathaniel and Lily stood beside her, and together they planted a young sycamore sapling in the earth. "Why here?" Lily asked. "Because this is where it started," Clara said. "This is where I learned what it means to show mercy, and I want to remember that. Always." They covered the roots with soil, packed it down gentle, and stepped back. The sapling was small, fragile, but its leaves were bright green, reaching toward the sun, just like everything else they'd built. Years later, people would talk about Mercy Hill. They'd talk about the woman who fed strays and the man who came back through the rain. They'd talk about the refuge that grew into something bigger than anyone had imagined, a place where the lost found safety, where the broken found healing, where mercy wasn't just given but lived. They'd talk about the little girl who grew up there, who learned to carve and to care, and who eventually took over when Clara and Nathaniel grew too old to do it themselves. And they'd talk about the sycamore on the hill, the one that grew tall and wide, its branches spreading like shelter, its roots deep and strong. The one that stood as a reminder of what happens when you choose kindness over cruelty, when you choose mercy over judgment, when you choose to love even when the world tells you it's foolish. Because in the end, love wasn't foolish at all. It was the only thing that mattered. The sun was setting now, painting the refuge in gold and amber light. Clara stood on the porch, older now, her hair gray, her hands worn, but her eyes were still bright, still watching, still seeing. Nathaniel stood beside her, one arm around her shoulders. Lily, grown now with children of her own, was down in the yard feeding the newest arrivals, and the dogs, always the dogs, ran through the grass, their joy simple and uncomplicated and pure. Clara leaned into Nathaniel, and he kissed the top of her head. "We did all right, didn't we?" he said. "We did better than all right," she said. "We did good." He smiled. "Yes, we did." And as the light faded and the stars began to appear, one by one, Clara thought about the woman she'd been, the woman who'd knelt in the mud with nothing but crumbs and compassion. And she thought about the miracle that had grown from that single act of kindness, a miracle built not from grand gestures, but from small moments of mercy, offered again and again, until they transformed into something beautiful, something lasting, something worth living for. The smoke curled from the chimney, soft and steady. The town below was quiet now, at peace. And on Mercy Hill, where the sycamore stood tall and the wildflowers bloomed eternal, love remained. And so Dry Hollow learned that mercy, once given, returns, often dressed as love,